Hello. So, welcome to the mock attempt of MockCat 9, MC2. You can call it whatever you want to call it. Basically, what we like to call it is the All India Open Mega Mock Challenge 2. Started on the 28th of September. We've continued it till about the 14th of October. And this is me going ahead with my live attempt right now. My basic objective in this live attempt, while I'll take it in one go of 2 hours, we'll actually break it down into 40-minute segments, 3 different segments, so that you can view it at your own comfort. I'll start off with the VARC section, move on to DILR, and then finally quant, exactly like CAT is. So I'm going to simulate it as much as possible. As and where we are unable to simulate it, I'll point out something. I'll use my methods of solving questions. Now, it's not necessary that I'll sit down and I'll explain every single solution. Why? Because I'm attempting a paper. I'm looking at it just like a student would, just like an examiner, exam or test taker would. So assume that I am a test taker today. Who has a 2-hour CAT mock in front of him or her, and I'm going to go ahead and take it, and my objective is I want to score a 99.7 plus, 99.8 plus, ensure that I get most of the IM calls and top B school calls. So it's as simple as that. I will not spend time explaining stuff. Yes, I will give, I'll try to explain the logic behind why I use a particular method, how I go about it, some shortcuts that I might use, specifically those which I might use, say in quant or DILR, my strategy of, prioritizing sets, or even in verbal, how I like to go about stuff. I generally like to start off with RCs. I like to spend a long time reading RCs so that I can retain some of the things that have been mentioned in the RCs, so that I don't need to do continuous back and forths, okay? And in VARC, my context is generally very, very simple. I'll try to attempt as many as possible. If the accuracy is around 70-80%, I'm happy. If I feel that my accuracy is going well, which sometimes you do feel if the options are far apart, then and you are able to eliminate it well, then I might be slightly more conservative on the attempt part, focusing on accuracy, because overall I know that in CAT 2020 102 was a 99 percentile. So in CAT 2021 the range should probably be around 100 to 110, not more than 2 or 3 questions simpler for sure. So if it's going to be around the 110 mark for a 99, then 99.5 should be around the 125 mark. 99.9 should be around the 140, 145 mark. So these are certain things going on in my mind, and basis that, I'd like to go ahead and take an attempt. Okay, so that's all that there is to it. There's nothing much. There's no rocket science. So this will be my attempt, the way I like to go about it. And as I said, there might be certain wacky things or certain things that I do which you don't necessarily need to emulate. It's just one of the ways in which the paper can be attempted. But the more important takeaway is, even I will make mistakes. Every human being makes mistakes. It's normal. We don't need to get too overwhelmed by that. Number one. Number two, there will surely be questions which I am unable to attempt. So it's okay. Calm down, relax. See how I go through it. Sometimes I might get stuck in a question for 2-3 minutes. How long do I get stuck? When do I decide to leave it? When do I decide to move on to the next one? How does getting stuck in a question affect my mindset? How does it impact how I attempt the other questions? Is there a specific order in which I want to do it? How do I prioritize which set to choose, or which question to choose, which topic to leave, and so on and so forth? Those are the things that I'd like you to focus on, rather than, focusing too much on, oh, he solved it this way, I solved it that way. Yes, that is also a takeaway. Probably there might be certain shortcuts that I do come up with, which hopefully will help you, but that's not the key takeaway. Key takeaway is temperament, calmness, and most importantly, you need to have a strategy in place. Okay, so that's it. Enough of a monologue, but I'll keep that and I'll deduct this time from my first section for sure, because this is right up front. So yeah, it shows to me that it's close to about 4 minutes already. So 40 minutes kickstarts now. Before that, my predominant focus in VARCs is RCs. I will surely attempt all verbal logic questions. I know that about 5 of them are non-MCQ, so I would like to go ahead and maximize the non-MCQ ones, because there is no negative marking there as well. So that's predominantly all that's going on in my brain. Okay, so that's about it. Let's quickly go ahead and let's kickstart this. Before that, I'll get my yellow trusted ink in place. That's it. Let's kickstart. Over. Let's start. Okay. Directions for question number 1 to 4. What does it state? Read the passage below and answer the questions that follow. Okay. Though he never actually crossed it, the Greek mathematician Pythagoras is sometimes credited with having first conceived of the equator, calculating its location on the Earth's sphere, more than 4 centuries before the birth of Christ. Aristotle, who never stepped over it either and knew nothing about the landscape surrounding it, pictured the equatorial region as a land so hot that no one could survive there, the torrid zone. For the Greeks, the inhabited world to the north, what they called the oikoumene, I don't know how you pronounce it, but whatever, oikoumene, existed opposite an uncharted region called the antipodes. The two areas were cut off from one another by the equator, an imaginary line often depicted as a ring of fire populated by mythical creatures. Okay, so no human beings according to them in around the equator. Okay, first created in the 7th century, the Christian Orbis Terrarum, which is the circle of the earth, or the maps, the Christian Orbis Terrarum maps, known for visual reasons as T and O maps, okay, included only the northern hemisphere. The T represented the Mediterranean Ocean, which divided the Earth's 3 continents, Asia, Africa and Europe, each of which was populated by the descendants of one of Noah's 3 sons. Jerusalem usually appeared at the center on the Earth's navel, umbilicum mundi, while Paradise, the Garden of Earth, was drawn to the east in Asia and situated at the top of the map. The O was the ocean surrounding the 3 continents. Beyond that was the Ring of Fire, was another ring of fire, okay. For the Catholic Church, the equator marked the border of civilization, okay, beyond which no humans, at least no followers of Christ, could exist. In the Divine Institutes, written between 303 and 311 CE, the theologian Lactantius ridiculed the notion that there could be inhabitants in the antipodes whose footsteps are higher than their heads. Other authors scoffed at the idea of a place where the rain must fall up. In 748, Pope Zachary declared the idea that people would exist in the antipodes on the other side of it heretical. So basically, the Catholic and the Christian belief is nobody will exist on the other side, at least surely no Christian will. Okay, so that's the belief, okay. The medieval argument was still rumbling on when Columbus first sailed southwest from Spain to the Indies in 1492. Columbus, who had been sub-Saharans in Portuguese, who had seen sub-Saharans in Portuguese ports in West Africa, disagreed with the church. Okay, so first person who's now disagreeing, okay. So this is important, first person who's disagreeing, okay. He claimed that the torrid zone was not uninhabitable, although he never actually crossed the equator. He did go beyond the borders of the European maps. When he inadvertently sailed to the Americas to navigate, Columbus used, among other, the Imago Mundi or the Imago Mundi, a work of cosmography written by the 15th century French theologian Pierre Dailly, which included one of the few T and O maps with north situated at the top. Columbus's eventual discovery of America stretched the horizons of the European mind. The equator was gradually reimagined, no longer the extreme limit of humanity or a geographical hell on Earth. It became simply the middle of Earth. Middle Earth, you know, Lord of the Rings or something, it reminds me. Okay, so I've basically taken almost 4 minutes, 3 minutes, 55 seconds to read this, and I'm happy. I think I've understood quite a bit of it. There are 4 questions. If these 4 questions I can answer in a matter of about 3.5 minutes, I am on track. That's how I like to do this. Okay. For the Catholic Church and authors such as Lactantius, where were the antipodes located? Directly opposite or something like that was being discussed. Okay. In the southern hemisphere, and after crossing an uncharted piece of territory, there was no place where southern hemisphere has been spoken about in the entire passage, so remove it. Directly opposite to northern hemisphere, okay, this is what it is today, but I don't think they spoke about that, but still we'll keep that. On the other side and upside down to the region where the Catholic Church members and the authors lived, I think it's more in sync with this, because they said that no Catholic will surely live there, it's on the other side and stuff like that. In the southern hemisphere, again southern hemisphere, so it's between B and C, directly opposite the northern hemisphere. They'd never spoken, they always spoke about no Christians can live there, it has to be opposite to where the Christians live, and all of those kind of things. Between B and C, best possible answer C. I don't need the technical jargons. Okay. Which of the following statements is a correct argument from the first paragraph? Okay, the Greek mathematician Pythagoras was definitely the first person. No, he was perhaps the first person. I'm sure they stated something like that, but I'll get to that. Aristotle didn't know anything about the topography surrounding the equator, but he correctly concurred that it was too hot for human habitation. How can he correctly conquer that when we know that as of today people live in the equator? So that's not correctly conquered. So this is surely wrong. The antipodes existed directly opposite to the region in which the Greeks lived after crossing an uncharted. No, they lived directly opposite to the region in which the Greeks lived. That was written. After crossing an uncharted, this was not mentioned. I'm trying to retain, that's why read and retain. The Greeks thought equator was populated by mythical creatures. This was categorically stated. So I don't even need to cross check the equator, by mythical creatures populated by them. That was something categorically stated. That has to be the answer. So factual questions, lovely. Which of the following cannot be correctly concluded from the second? Okay. By the 7th century, Christians knew that the earth was a spheroid. Nowhere has this been mentioned. According to 7th century, nowhere is this cannot be correctly. Okay, so this could be the answer. Why did I cross it out? Cannot be correctly. So this seems to be the answer to me because spheroid has never been mentioned anywhere. Okay, let's look at the others. According to 7th century Christians, Asia, Africa, Europe were populated by Christians. Okay, Noah's 3 sons, Jerusalem and stuff they were talking about. So Christians, this is possible. So this won't be the answer. Jerusalem was a very important place for Christians, already spoken about. 7th century Christians ignorant of geography. We've understood everybody was ignorant of geography. We shouldn't really blame them, but that, yeah. So cannot be correctly concluded has to be the first. Spheroid and all were not spoken about. Lovely. Okay, and I'm 7 minutes into it. Last question. Lovely. Why did Columbus travel in the southwest direction? It was some maps, some maps that he was following, which was mentioned. I don't remember the name. He had seen sub-Saharans from south in Portuguese ports. No. He knew the equator was located at the south and was habitable and he intended to cross it. No. He had used a Imago Mundi map which showed not at the top. Exactly. That's what I had stated. So you saw the entire question has come through memory because I spent time on reading. I tried understanding every paragraph. I took it in and then I went there. Okay. Let's look at the second. Now, it won't happen in every, but in this RC it did. Hopefully, it will happen in others as well. At least some of the questions. Okay. At the heart of US sociology are two interlocking fixations, method and race. Okay. Together, they prop up a liberal fantasy of discovering black pain, of somehow measuring it and then documenting it in great detail again and again. Black identities and lived experiences are endlessly layered and diverse, but this is a problem for methodologies that require or presume fixed categories to produce research that is generalizable, verifiable and replicable, the hallmarks of social scientific inquiry. So these are the hallmarks. Okay. Regardless of whether the work is qualitative or quantitative, it's the purported empiricism of the field that separates it from the humanities and interdisciplinary studies, encouraging a flattening of the black life that overlooks its diversity and pleasures. Blackness is treated only through the lens of social problems. We are defined by where we fall on normal distributions or bell curves that track how much we adhere to white norms or else remain social outliers. So everything is judged basis whiteness, and if you don't fall basis the calculations of whiteness, you're considered outliers, and that's why this entire thing of black pain has come up with, because there is standardization that has happened just through whiteness. That's predominantly my takeaway, okay, from the first para. Okay. Increasingly, the public face of sociology is dominated by urban ethnography. Okay. Researchers often flock to this qualitative arena to study race and racism because it promises to reveal stories from the perspective of those being examined. Okay. So I will understand from the perspective of the subject, of the person, of the victim, of the person being examined. Okay. Ethnography allows researchers to delve deeper and to tease out subtleties that are glossed over in official state documents and surveys. The methodology has a faithful following, especially among idealistic graduate students and professors hoping to reconnect to the social justice concerns that carried them into the field in the first place. Okay. It affords them far more intimate access to their objects of study than other researchers can hope to attain, while positioning them as deeply sympathetic and eager to learn in fine detail how specific individuals experience and deal with a system that is hopeless. Okay, so this positions them well because I am giving you importance, the subject importance. I'm trying to learn from you, especially why? Because how specific experience individuals experience deal with the system are hopelessly rigged against them. So this is important, categorically mentioned that the system is perhaps totally rigged against these people. Okay. Yet even the most self-aware ethnographers can succumb to blind spots. Now yet, when I read, that means there is a comparison, there is a difference, so this will generally be an important line. Okay. In her ethnography On the Run, Fugitive Life in whatever the name, Alice Goffman pieces together a compelling account of how easily young black men find themselves ensnared in the criminal justice system from a young age. Okay, they are hunted by police like prey and arrested, often for non-violent offences, unpaid fines, missed court dates, and other minor probation. Now, most self-aware can succumb to blind spots. That is followed by what is mentioned about Alice Goffman. So there is a high chance that Alice Goffman is used as an example to build up on this statement that even the most self-aware succumb to blind spots. So Alice Goffman must have succumbed to some blind spot. That's the relationship in my mind. Okay. Goffman spent 6 years in a neighborhood in West Philadelphia where that she dubbed 6th Street. At the time, she was a sociology undergraduate, then graduate student working with some of the most prominent urban ethnographers in the field. Goffman set out to understand how poor black neighborhoods are over-policed and what effects this relentless surveillance had on the lives of a group of teenagers and young men. Okay, she spent time with them at home and on the stoop. She visited them in hospitals, in jails, and at sentence hearings. In the book, Goffman forms close relationship with the men and appears genuinely concerned about their welfare with their families and girlfriends. Okay, when their families and girlfriends prove unreliable support systems in threatening to call the police to resolve disputes over child support, for example, knowing that the young men have active warrants out for their arrest. The boys and men seem to have only each other and Goffman. Okay, so there is some sort of, as it was pointed out here, there might be some sort of blind spot that is categorically being stated here as well from a Goffman perspective. Okay, let's look at the questions. How can we deduce that Alice Goffman succumbed? So we know that she did, like I pointed out. How can we deduce? Okay, her book details only social problems that black people face. Okay, the ease with which black men are ensnared in the criminal justice system from a young age, that is not a blind spot. So what was her blind spot? Her blind spot was she decided that all of these issues are with black people. She remained in a community of black people. She saw this. It was like self-justification. Does this happen with other white people? Did she stay in that community? Did she judge it basis that? We don't know whether she did. You can only come to a research conclusion when you compare others, is basically what's coming to my mind. So this seems to be the blind spot. So to me, probably option A might be the blind spot. Let's look at the other options. B surely is not there. Black people, especially men, were hunted by police as if they were prey. That's not necessarily a blind spot. As a sociologist, she worked with the most prominent urban ethnographers in the field whose methods were flawed. No, that's not a blind spot either. So the only blind spot was that in the book details only social problems that black people face. Only, the word only is the problem. That's the blind spot. Why are you only talking about this? Okay, cool. All of the following statements may be considered valid inferences from the passage except which one? Okay, inferences. Let's see. Urban ethnography is popular because the stories are told from the perspective of the person being examined. This is true. Research on multi-layered and diverse lives is not easily verifiable or replicable. This was also mentioned. True. The criminal justice system in the US treats all ethnicities equally. No, this has nowhere been mentioned. They stated that it is unjust for black people, and what are the problems that happen, categorically stated. So this is surely not true. Okay, I don't even need to check more. According to the passage, which is not the author's viewpoint. Not the author's viewpoint, not. Okay. Sociology works through observations and experiments. Okay, this is fine because that is ethnographers, observing and all. This seems okay. Sociology in the US is fixated at studying black people because they are socially problematic. The very first paragraph, obsessed with black people. Goffman formed close relation with the subject. This is also true, all stated. Urban ethnographers is another flawed form of sociology. This has not been mentioned anywhere. This part was not mentioned that this is flawed or not flawed. They just stated that this is perhaps one of the most famous, one of the most liked ways of sociology, urban ethnography. So yeah, that's wrong. Which set of keywords below most closely captures the arguments of the passage in the right order? Okay. Method and race was spoken about. Urban ethnography, second paragraph, Goffman's book, So I know in the last part you're talking about, Goffman actually spending time with the black people, understanding them in Philadelphia and stuff like that. So the last part is either an observation or a work. It's not her life, it's not her book. So it's either observation or work, the last part. So it's either A or B. Now let's compare A or B. Second last, both are same. Second para, both are same. Let's look at the first para. Method and race and US sociology. I think predominantly US sociology was being spoken about in terms of what is it that we need to see and what US sociology is based on. So let's have a look at that. Let's go back to the passage. At the heart of US sociology are two interlocking fixations. The very first line, at the heart of US sociology. So I think that will be the answer, US sociology. Hence option A, once again, color in place. Goffman's observations. Yep, sociology is the answer. So option B. That will be it for me. Okay. Third para, and it seems like I've taken about almost 16 minutes now. So it's okay. 8 minutes is fine. I'd like to bring that down to 7. Let's see. The decomposition of the West is not only a geopolitical fact, it is also cultural and intellectual. Leading Western countries contain powerful bodies of opinion that regard their own civilization as a pernicious force. In this hyper-liberal view, Western values of freedom and toleration mean little more than racial domination. If it still exists as a civilizational bloc, the West must be dismantled. Okay, so not only geopolitical, it's cultural and intellectual. So there is decomposition happening. Contain powerful bodies of opinion that regard their own civilization as a pernicious force. It is hyperliberal. So there is another point of view called hyperliberal. Okay, hyperliberalism is a catechism policed by peer pressure and professional sanctions. Okay, this is important. Those who enforce it like to dismiss practices such as cancellation as nightmares of the fevered right-wing mind with no basis in fact. At the same time, they believe disagreement is an exercise in repression. So this is not an easy passage to read, and I'll just try to paraphrase it in my mind to understand what is happening. In the hyper-liberal credo, only what are regarded as simple, self-evident, morally impeccable truths can be tolerated. Okay. Only impeccable truths, simple, self-evident, morally. Only that. Okay. So that is hyper-liberal. Okay. Assessing the costs and possible benefits of Western empires for the people they governed is not far from being a prohibited enterprise, as is examining the involvement of non-Western states in slavery. Some of the right have compared such ideological restrictions to those enforced under communism. Okay, the difference is that in Western society, these curbs on free inquiry are self-imposed. Okay, so the difference between communism and this is stated. In the Western world, it is free, it is self-imposed. In communism, it was enforced. Okay, the upshot is that the liberal West is more a subject of historical investigation than a contemporary reality. So liberal West seems as if it is something in the past. It doesn't seem like it's today. Okay. Those who believe humankind is converging on liberal values overlook the fact that Western societies are fast discarding them. Okay. That does not mean hyperliberalism has won. Democracy, so far as it still functions, imposes limits on ideological orthodoxy. So hyperliberalism has not won. This is still talking about democracy. Okay. The marketplace, for all its excesses, produces alternatives. Venues encouraging intellectual pluralism continue to survive. Hyperliberalism is the ideology of an aspirant ruling class that aims to hoard wealth and position while flaunting its immaculate progressive credentials. Intractable culture wars and an epistemic crisis in what key factual and scientific questions have been politicized are a part of a bid for power by these counter elites. Okay. But except in New Zealand and Canada, there is no sign of them having achieved hegemony. Okay. Only two places where, okay. Even so, schools are pressured to teach a single version of history. Private corporations sack employees for deviant opinions, and cultural institutions such as guardians of orthodoxy act as guardians of orthodoxy. Okay, the prototype for these practices is the US, which regards its singular history and divisions as defining every modern society. So basically US is too full of itself. Okay. is basically what the passage is saying. In much of the world, the woke movement is regarded with indifference, or as in the case of France, where Macron has denounced it as racializing society hostility. But wherever the American agenda prevails, society is no longer liberal in any historically recognizable sense. Okay. The evanescence of Western liberalism does not mean we inhabit a post-Western world. Arguments of Western decline are usually rehashed versions of Samuel Huntington's speculations about clashing civilizations, joined with prognostications of inescapable Chinese supremacy. Such claims reflect the sharp contraction of Western power, but they miss the most remarkable feature of the contemporary scene, the continuing dominance of modern Western ideas, not those of liberalism as traditionally understood, but mixture of fascism, communalism, and integral nationalism. Both China and Russia, avowed rivals of the West, are ruled by ideas that derive from Western sources. Okay, important. What the Western confronts is not the threatening advance of alien civilization, but its own dark shadows. So West needs to be afraid of its own self, in short. Okay. Not an easy passage to understand. Let's look at the questions. Which one of the following best expresses the author's argument, expresses the main argument of the author, okay, has disintegrated geopolitically, culturally and intellectually. Yes, this has been stated, but not necessarily the main idea. Hyperliberalism has superseded, no, not superseded, that they've categorically stated hasn't happened. Western civilization is threatened by derivatives, some of its ideals. It is threatened by its own shadow. The very last line, if I look at, it was stated here, threatening advance of what confronts is not this, but its own dark shadows. I think that is where the answer comes. Western civilization, answer is option C. Okay. Author makes all of the following arguments in the passage except which of the following? Hyperliberalism, double standards on disagreement and cancellation. Okay, some Western ideas such as fascism are continuing while others are being discarded. This is mentioned. Democracy survives in a few pockets in spite of hegemony of hyper. This is different, right? They were just saying that only two places, Canada and New Zealand, is where hyperliberalism has hegemony. Everybody, that's the only two places. So it's actually the opposite of what is stated. So it has to be C. I don't even need to check A and B. I had doubt over A, but I don't need to go back because this is exactly the opposite of what they stated when they spoke about New Zealand and Canada. Which one of the following best expresses the similarity as well as the difference between West and communism? I remember them categorically stating that in the West it was self-imposed, in communism it was enforced. Something like that. Both Western imposed ideological reformer imposed fewer restrictions. No. Both Western had imposed restriction on free inquiry, but in the case of former it was voluntary, while in the case of the latter it was enforced. This is what I was saying. Self-imposed versus enforced. Correct. Okay. Which of the following can be inferred? Modern civilization is a post-Western civilization. China and Russia are the torch bearers of Western liberalism in modern world. Hyperliberalism is the cult of counter elites aspiring for hegemony. Ideological orthodoxy is synonymous with democracy. Now, if I'm looking here, China and Russia are the torch bearers of Western liberalism in the modern world. I don't think. Modern civilization is the post-Western civilization. Not necessarily something that is being inferred. Hyperliberalism is the cult of counter elites aspiring for hegemony in the world. So this they've stated. You are basically counter elites who are aspiring for hegemony. When they spoke about and defined who basically the counter elites were, they'd gone ahead and categorically spoken about what they do. So if I go back to the passage, regarded as, hyperliberalism is the ideology of an aspirant ruling class that aims to hoard wealth and position while flaunting its immaculate progressive credentials, intractable cultural wars, and an epistemic crisis in which key factual and scientific questions have been politicized are a part of a bid for power for these counter elites. But except in New Zealand, Canada, there is no sign. I think this is basically what is being spoken about. No, it wasn't this question, it was this one. Okay. Hyperliberalism is the thing. Now this is what happens, you heave a sigh when you are confused between options, and I'm actually confused here. I think it's C. Ideological orthodoxy synonymous with democracy? No. This is no. So I'm between A and C. Now we know that it is post-Western civilization. So between A and C, I'll go with C. I think that is predominantly coming from the paragraph that I just referenced. Of the following sets of concepts, identify the set that is conceptually closest to the concerns of the passage. Okay. Right towards the end of the passage, they were talking about Western ideas. Okay, they were talking about what is basically happening in terms of China and Russia also being just one. It's a post-Western colonization or something like that. So some sort of Western ideas were surely being spoken about. In between, hyper-liberalism followed by liberalism, that is for sure, and that only comes here. Dismantling of the West is where it started. So I would go with option A, problem with the West, then hyperliberalism, what it is, then what is liberalism, and finally Western idea. I think that's it. Okay, so that means 26 minutes down. I can spend another 5 minutes on this passage, not more than that. I would like to keep 8-9 minutes for the end. So let's see. Exploring different kinds of damage that children can suffer. So 4 minutes to read is basically what I would like to do. In 1 minute, even if I can answer 2-3 questions, I'm happy. If it means stretching by 30 seconds, I'll do that. So let's see. Exploring different kinds of damage that children can suffer and the ways in which damage keeps resurfacing throughout those children's life, the novel begins with the confessions of a light-skinned mother who is repulsed by her daughter's blue-black color. I used to pray she would slap my face or spank me just to feel her touch. The girl, whose name is Lula Ann Bridewell, later reveals. Her mother insists that her brusque treatment of the girl has offered necessary lessons for survival in a hostile world. Now at 23, Lula Ann has changed her name simply to Bride and has morphed into an imposingly beautiful fashionista and businesswoman preparing to launch her own cosmetics line. Yet she falls to pieces when a boyfriend, Booker, suddenly dumps her, re-exposing the vulnerable, unloved child self that still cowers beneath her grown-up facade. So she's grown up, she's matured, there is a positive vibe, strong woman vibe, but that's a facade. Deep down, she's still vulnerable, she's still afraid that nobody loves her, her mother hating her, not touching her, not talking to her probably took a toll. That's predominantly the first para, okay? Bride sets off to find and confront Booker, who is grappling with unfinished childhood trauma of his own, for he is the brother of a murdered boy who could not relinquish his grief when his family chose to move on. So Booker couldn't relinquish the grief, okay? Over the years, Booker has made outward strides towards mature adulthood, studying economics for a postgraduate degree and playing the trumpet for fun in small jazz clubs. But he remains emotionally stunted, forever traumatized by his brother's death, which has become, in the words of the sympathetic aunt who had once counseled him not to let it go, his own life. I think it's his only life. So both are facing traumas of the past, Bride and Booker, okay? And so it comes to pass that the romance of Bride and Booker seems doomed. Their fairy tale castle collapsed into the mud and sand on which its vanity was built. Morrison weaves all sorts of folkloric imagery throughout Bride's journey as she ventures from city into the woods to search for Booker in a Northern California logging town. There is a kindly forest-dwelling couple and their changeling child, then a momentous rainstorms and a fateful yellow rose. There is even a dose of magic realism when Bride notices, or does she imagine it, that her body appears to be reverting to its original childhood form. So this is basically creative license. All of this, faff around the actual thing that you want to talk about is being spoken about, okay? Harrison deploys these tropes of enchantment. See, I told you all, for the lack of a better term, faff. Faff means all the nonsense around which, it's like a Bollywood movie, there are songs, there's music, there's dance, there's laughter, but there is a storyline. The storyline is, in a sense, all of this is faff around it. So that's what it is. Not to soothe or entertain, of course, but to provide how durable are the wounds of the past, how locked we are into its familiar tunes and lyrics. Along with Booker and Bride, there are 4 other voices who narrate the novel's actions. All are victims in some way and all have a story to tell about the everlasting damage inflicted by the powerful upon the unprotected among us. Okay. Morrison deliberately offers only the lovely bones of the story, where some might wish for a fairy tale landscape more extravagantly decorated with raiment, jewels and woodland creatures. This is not to suggest that the book is monotonous. There is a tonal variety here of a carefully curated sort and some leavening humor. At one point, Bride complains about the tedium of television, mostly blood, lipstick and the haunches of anchor girls. But what we might wish for, as very reluctant grown-ups must admit, is a yawning chasm or chasm away from what we need. Okay, what we wish for, as everyone yawning from what we need. So what we wish for and what we need are two different things. Okay, God help the child is clearly and forcefully the effort of a writer impatient to cast off every superfluity to expose the rage and sadness at its heart. Okay, so this is almost like a book review or a movie review, whatever. It's a review. Perfect. And 30 minutes down I am. So 2 minutes is what I like to spend. Okay. What about Morrison book can we infer? It is about racial abuse inflicted on a poor family. No. It is about racial segregation and effect. It is about sorrow and anger. It is the good blend of victimization and humor. Racial segregation and its effect on the ostracized. Racial segregation. What in the segregation for Booker, it wasn't racial, right? Only for the first girl it was racial. So I will say it is not racial only. So it's some past trauma which you carry forward. Victimization and humor, sorrow and anger. Between these two, I'll go for sorrow and anger. It's predominantly that, and I think that was written in the last para as well, to expose the rage and sadness at its heart. Rage is anger, sadness is sorrow. So that's, I think, what it is. Okay. What are the tropes of enchantment? I told you all the faff around it. The wounds of the characters of the novel experienced in the past, the long-lasting effect of the wounds on the characters, of the damage inflicted by the powerful people on the weak and vulnerable, flash storms and other imagery that have undercurrents of fantasy. Told you all the faff. Simple. They asked it as well. Okay. The yawning chasm. So what we need and what we get, something like that, right? The gap between ambition and achievement. Neither of ambition or achievement is what we need. So that's wrong. Powerful and peerless, no. Happy, the gap between the happy world of make believe that we want, so what we want, and the reality that we ought to see, that means what we need. This seems right. Yep, C is the answer. The tone of the passage: argumentative, analytical, nostalgic, emotional, pessimistical, cynical. So it's not pessimistic nor is it cynical for sure. Argumentative, not really. He's been very analytical for sure. He's evaluated and he's given what I think was good, what I think didn't go well, and also I'd go with B for sure. Romance of Bride and Booker June because was built in vanity. They were both too proud and arrogant. Both are wrong. Built on mud. They are both emotionally traumatized and not strong or stable. This is what it was from the beginning. Okay, not bad. So if I remove 4 and so 32 minutes and about 30 odd seconds, I have 7.5 minutes to go. All 18 of RC handled. I'm sure I'll get at least 15-16 right. Even if I get 15 right, 3 wrong, 42. Looking at the passages, I am quite sure if verbal logic is even moderate level, 43, 44 would be 99. I'm already probably knocking on the door for a 99. So I'm happy. I'll be calm. Next 7.5 minutes. All the non-MCQs I'll surely attempt. I'll guess if needed. And I'd like to get at least 2 or 3 more right to get into the 99.5 plus of verbal. Okay. 5 jumbled related are given, 4 of them put together to form a coherent. Okay, so odd one out. Before the late modern era, most religious and ideologies took it for granted that death was an inevitable fate. New Testament, shortly before the crucifixion of a woman anointed nice with precious oil worth 300 denarii. So these are both different things. Here talks about death, here talks about what Christ has gotten. Let's look at the next. Try to imagine Islam, Christianity or the ancient Egyptian without death. So death and death twice. Moreover, most face turn death. Again death. Of all mankind insoluble problems, one has remained the most vexing, interesting and important, death. It's all death. Only the second one is not death. So the answer has to be 2. It's weird. Okay. But while, so this is not where it will begin. I think now we need to put them in a proper sequence. Okay. But while multi survived the end Cretaceous extinction without missing a beat, the species in Asia virtually disappeared. They filled the same niche in the age of dinosaurs many years. This left an ideological. It shouldn't start with but. Chance that it starts with this is also low. They is also low. So I think 4 is where the most successful mammalia form group of all time was the multituberculate squirrel-like beasts that chisel like teeth at the front of their mouth and cheek teeth brimming with cusps. This is where it will start. Okay, 4. But while multiple survived, okay, they filled the same niche. Okay, This left an ecological gap. What left an ecological gap? The ecological gap should be after they are extinct. So 3 should come after 1. So 1, 3. They fill the same niche in the age of dinosaurs as many. So 1, 3 has to come together. Now either it is 4, 2, 1, 3 or 4, 1, 3, 2. 2 does not come after 3 for sure. There is no relation. So I'll go with 4, 2, 1, 3. Okay. Jumbled related are given. 4 of them can be put together. Okay. Once again, odd one out. Okay. There was nothing remotely Pakistani or Islamic or Asian about the building, which my minder said, wobbling his head approvingly, was PM's own design. Crystal chandeliers dangled, sometimes two or three to a room, oils for sunflowers and tumbling kittens that would have looked quite at home on the railings around Hyde Park hung below garishly gilded cornices. Potted ferns sprouted from Kish Neo-Egyptian bowls. So they are once again talking about how it was decorated or something, right? Designs, okay. After the grey architectural brutalism that had gone before, the Prime Minister's residence crowning the hill was something of a surprise. A giddy pseudo-Mexican ranch house with white walls and a white tile, which is exactly why the West has always had a soft spot for Benazir Bhutto. Inside it was the same story. So this looks like the outside. If I look at it, it looks like 3, 1, 5 and 2 are the answer. 3, 1, 5, 2. But they've asked me for the odd one out. 4 is odd one out. So 4. 4 I can't see putting anywhere. 3, 1, 5, 2 seems like a paragraph to me actually. Okay, so I have about 3 minutes and 7 seconds to go. Okay. Unlike ideas of air, food and water that allow us to think about the everyday resources we need to survive, the venerable notions of knowledge, truth or justice don't obviously cater to practical needs. On the contrary, these exalted ideals draw our gaze away from practical pursuits. They are imbued with grandeur precisely because of their superb indifference to mundane human concerns. Having knowledge is practically useful, but why would we also need the concept of knowledge? The concept of knowledge, truth or justice appears to have been important enough to emerge across different cultures and endure over ages. Okay. Unlike idea of air, food and water that allow us to think about the everyday resources we need to, the venerable notion of knowledge, truth or justice don't obviously cater to practical needs. These exalted draw gaze away from practical pursuits. They are imbued with grandeur precisely because the superb indifference to mundane human concerns is practically useful, but why would we also need the concept of knowledge? Okay. Although the concept of knowledge, truth or justice does not have practicality of ideas on air, food, they are important enough to have emerged. No, the concept of knowledge was being questioned, so this is wrong. Appears grand because it is not the practical. Again, concept of knowledge is being questioned. Truth does not have the practicality of ideas on air. They appear to be important enough to have emerged across different cultures over the ages. That was the question, right? Concept, knowledge, truth, justice appear to have been important enough to emerge across different cultures and endure over ages. Although the concept, knowledge, truth, or justice does not have practicality of ideas on air, they appear to have. This is exactly what is stated. So this seems okay. Okay. 1.5 minutes I have. Okay. But as news from earlier this year has shown, it still exists. Okay, so I need the correct order. It still exists as a supremacist dog whistle. The US House of America First Caucus published a 7-page policy platform claiming that the country's borders and culture are strengthened by a common respect for uniquely Anglo-Saxon political traditions. Its association with witnesses has saturated a lexicon to the point that it's often misused in political discourse and weaponized. The term Anglo-Saxon little used in mainstream American circles, perhaps as a chiding was. Chiding is scolding, wasp, label directed. Okay. The term is little used in mainstream, but as new it still exists. So 4 and 1 are interlinked for sure. Okay. In April, the House of America First Caucus published a 7-page platform claiming that the country's borders and culture are strengthened by common respect For Anglo-Saxon, I have just 30 seconds left. Association with witnesses saturated a lexicon. 413. Its association will come from here. So 4132. Okay. Oh, no time for summary. Let me leave this. I don't want negative marks. Again, summary, I don't want negative marks. Okay. Order. Former included Western Japan, 15% of the world. Scholars have analyzed the world in terms of Orient and Occident. Okay. This was reflected in a sense while one word. Okay. No time. Oh, both have started with 4, so I will start with 4. Both had 1 after that, right? 4132, 4123. So let's say 4321. Just put in a random thing. There's no negative marking, so I'll attempt it. This is it. This is my attempt for the verbal section. I think RC went off quite decently. I don't think I would have gotten more than 2 or 3 wrong. I'm hopeful that not even that. In verbal, if I had a little bit more time, I think I could have done it. 2 questions I've left. 1 I've just guessed. So those 3 are surely out of the way. Remaining 5, even if I'm getting 3 right and 2 wrong, that will still be close to about 9 marks. Let's assume 1 MCQ is wrong, so that's about 8 marks. If in RCs, I can say even if I get say 4 wrong, so that will be 38, 42, 38 plus 8 marks here, 46. Worst case scenario 46, 99.1, 99.2. Ideally, I think I shouldn't have gotten more than 2 or 3 wrong. So best case scenario 2 wrong in RC, that would mean about 46. And here probably say again, let's say 1 wrong. So 4, that's 11. So that's 57, which would be a 99.8, 99.9. So I'll be between 99.1 and 99.8 for sure. Basis my attempt. I think I'll be somewhere in between. Basis my understanding. But yeah, seemed okay. Once again, reading the RCs became the crux. Spending time on reading them so that I can answer through memory. As you must have realized, my going back and forth really low. I wanted to remember, I wanted to take some time, read the passage, understand what each paragraph was stating, and thereby go ahead and answer. So that's it. Now I'll move on to the DILR section. Bye.